Well, a very warm welcome again to this second lecture in the Darwin lecture series on the theme of beauty. I said last week when I introduced the series that the organisers wanted to explore the often paradoxical nature of beauty. And tonight we're with the visual arts. And in the visual arts, of course, distortion and incongruity have been recurring and very stimulating themes from Hieronymus Bosch to Hogarth to Picasso to Max Ernst to Francis Bacon, etc. Our title tonight is Beauty in the Grotesque, and our speaker is José Hernández, who is himself an artist based in Spain. He works in oil and watercolours and with etchings and in lithography. He's had over 40 one-man shows all around the world. He's also illustrated books and designed the sets and costumes for a score of major theatrical productions. With his work in the very rich Spanish tradition of Goya and Dali, it's a great pleasure to introduce José Hernández.
Ladies and gentlemen, I find myself in something or a quandary. You have done me the signal honor of inviting me to talk to you on the subject What a beginning. So, you have done me the signal honor of inviting me to talk to you on the subject of beauty and the grotesque. And I am grateful and delighted, please believe me, to be in such distinguished company. But alas, my knowledge of the Queen's English is far from adequate to the task required of me today, and my comments, conceived necessarily in Spanish, have been rendered into your tongue by a native speaker and writer who assured me that the task has been far from easy. I am not surprised, not only because of the very different essences of the two languages, but because writing is not and never has been the natural mode of expression of a painter, and I am not exception to the rule. My translator, moreover, has had to cope with my personal linguistic quirks, perhaps a trifle baroque, and this has been a further source of complication. You are, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, regretful forewarned. While I shall do everything in my power to convey to you as accurately as possible my feelings rather than ideas concerning beauty and the grotesque, I must beg for your understanding and tolerance, all the more so since among you are here, no doubt, teachers and student of aesthetics, of history of art, and of the fine arts, and I imagine, by extension, of history, philosophy, and semiotics. Despite all the obstacles, and believing, as I do, that what really counts is communication, whether by means of words or signs, I think that the best thing I can do to start with is to tell you something of my personal experience as an artist. That is to say, of the insatiable curiosity which has driven me all my life to try my hand, albeit timidly, at other disciplines which have turned out to be complementary to my principal activity as a painter. I mean engraving, the illustration of literary texts, the production of sets for the theater, and sculpture. To conclude this preamble, I must insist that I am not here as a specialist in beauty, aesthetics, or semiotics, something I have never pretended to be. To pose as such would be to indulge in impersonation, hypocrisy, and pedantry, all of which vices I detest. As for my views on the ugly or the grotesque, I hope that they will become clear later in my comments on their paradoxical relation to beauty. Image? Oh, yes. Let me explain first, then, that I was born to paint and began quite spontaneously before I reached my adolescence in a setting completely alien to such an activity and in circumstances hardly propitious. One would have thought to artistic inclination. The scarce knowledge of art that I possess was acquired in the first place through the practice of painting itself, and later through reading. All of this with no other purpose than to become a person, to find my way in the world. My dreams gave rise to more dreams. Some of them, lots of them, began to materialize so much so that I am still part of them. For example, I draw and paint every single day of my life. In those early flights of imagination, I proved, or better, I discovered, that beauty existed not only in nature, but also in paintings, words, sounds, and gestures, and so on. Little by little, my naivety began to turn into something more real, something more difficult to cope with. I refer to ignorance. Someday it has to happen, and it did. I realized that painting and creativity were more than simply that. That painting itself was almost of the secondary importance. That one had to go deeper. I grasped that the mere contemplation that I had practiced up to then was tantamount to remaining satisfied with the surface of things. I perceived that things were no longer simply pretty, that some of them, moreover, were beautiful. From those dreams, among those dreams, I learned in a blink of an eye, in icto oculi, to compare these dreams with the external world. I learned to distinguish in the midst of the diversity, to give things their name and to weight them up with the corresponding risk. This involved what beauty meant for me or for others. I admit that this made me feel different and that I suffered without understanding what this new phenomenon signified for me at a personal level. It took me a while to comprehend what the prodigy of beauty signified in the aesthetic category. For example, in Greek art, I grasped that despite the diversity of tastes, tendencies, or circumstances, artists succeeded in stamping their own style on their work, giving us certain clues to a better understanding of their respective personality and, with this, their different visions or interpretations of beauty. There are also innumerable versions of the same image or theme which, for diverse reasons, have become icons. And this makes us think that those terms or concepts, such as beauty, can vary or be interpreted in very different ways without losing their essence. At all events, one cannot believe before starting out to paint that one is in the process of creating beauty, because no matter how exact the formula, if there be such, it is the result that proves whether a work attains the category of the beautiful. Beauty, that is, cannot be fabricated at will. The aesthetic object only manifests itself or fails to do so in the external world once the imagined work has come into existence. One theory of the origin of arts holds that the empirical reality mixes the beautiful and the ugly automatically, just as nature does, so that in order to enjoy the beautiful in itself and for itself, it must have been produced or included it in a familiar context. As a theory, it is valid enough, although somewhat restrictive nowadays, since the familiar context can be different, or generalizing its point of departure can be fiction. Frankly, I am not sure about this or other theories, since in my case, the impulse to begin a painting comes directly for a sensation captured or visualized relatively quickly on paper, most frequently without allowing any disturbance or attention to the so-called rules to inhibit or delay the representation of the initial prompting. In fact, no premeditation is involved, or very little, since the process is more spontaneous than otherwise. Later may be changed, but generally minimal. Another phenomenon which normally occurs at the fearful moment in which one has to face the as yet immaculate surface of the canvas or drawing paper is a sensation of vertigo, and vertigo that lasts as long as the sensation itself, whether this be protected or ephemeral. Well, this picture could represent any little corner in any studio and of any artist, painter. In this case, it is my habitat, where I live, the space where I let myself be surprised every day, and where my dreams, when I am lucky, become a sketch. Well, going back to my beginnings, the die was cast. I had to be a painter before all else. That was clear. And I needed to know urgently the answer to a pressing question. If it was art that brought beauty to our attention, what brought the ugly? And if it was beauty, what then was ugliness? Was the opposite with the same consistency, the same meaning, but in the opposite sense? More questions came to me one after the other. I found that reading was the only process that helped me to situate these values at points where I could grasp their significance. I went on painting, of course, painting naturally, almost in frenzy, as I still do, reaching out for everything that presented itself without knowing whether it was good or bad, including for the health of the adolescent I was then. My conclusions, or rather revelations, allowed me to continue my way along the mysterious path, avid to discover how to become myself, no matter what happened afterward, avid to launch out into territory, if as yet unknown, intuited. I still ask myself, to tell the truth, how I came to feel, to sense the nearest of beauty, before knowing that such a thing existed and had a name. This painting by Diego de Velázquez, the Venice in the middle, well known in this country, represents for an artist who could be myself one of the clearest examples of beauty in painting. Evidently, there are other examples by other authors, but of this one in particular, with the objectivity that is required, one could confidently assert that besides the genius of the painter, it represents the balance and the proper measure in the use of its components. It deals with, in the end, a perfect work of art in the formal sense of the term. Putting to one side, for the moment, other considerations such as what might happen to me, the mere intention became what I most yearned for, knowledge of something called beauty and its affinities. I set out as bravely as possible on my search for and initiated by my artistic adventure, convinced that it was my destiny, and an uncertain destiny, to be sure, but one which I felt intuitively would bring me something uniquely different, something inspiring, something that I was looking for and not finding in my current environment. Clearly, my vital interests were now of another order. Painting was no longer merely a representation of what I saw around me, but something invisible that urged me to explore imaginary territories. It was always necessary either to transfer this diffuse imagined onto paper. To feel satisfied, it was enough to have experienced having imagined them, or at most simply to make a few jottings in a notebook. The experience could hardly have been more arresting or better fascinating. The jottings were equivalent to the numerous drawings happened on my desk or pinned to the wall, drawings that later perhaps would be turned or not into paintings and engravings. There were no guarantees, but I have to say that such a system enabled me, and still does, to live my reveries more intensively and pleasurably. The construction of a personal set of values was becoming an essential to me, as was the acquisition of certain technical rudiments. Meanwhile, I never stopped asking myself if ugliness was really the opposite of beauty. And if this were so, what place was occupied by the grotesque? We know that another source of attraction is ugliness. If it is true that the equation ugly is equal to bad exists, we will not be surprised to learn that the one is as ancient as the other, and that both terms were born simultaneously, with the resulting and inevitable doubt concerning the preference for the one or the other. More than when I was concerned to know which were the first criteria used to define the terms beauty, the ugly, the grotesque, the sinister, etc. Concerned to ask what does that person in love with a shadow suggest to us. Shadows have always been more related to the sinister than to beauty. Yet there is a paradox here because a shadow can be also beautiful as light. As can be seen, our habitual codes are or little used in case like this, in which the senses and instinct lead us to what gives us pleasure, relief, well-being. Does it turn out, then, that the primitive notion of good and evil is not so crazy after all? To pose and answer these questions, to uncover the unknown, to come close to their hold of mystery is what enriches and permits us to acquire a certain ability to reason, to discern, to choose what is most suited or to our needs, avoiding what makes us experience fear, unease, rejection, of repugnance. Let us admit that this is all very well, although I may disagree at times, but what about the other pleasure, the pleasure produced by transgression, the progress of a metamorphosis, things that can be otherwise? Let us not forget Goya's asseveration that the sleep of reason produces monsters. This image could illustrate a long discourse about the tremendous power of the imagination. The strength with which this title is expressed says much of the author's personality and his resistance to making concessions. What are these feelings that move us to transgress, to infringe established precepts? It is perhaps reason itself that enjoys us to do so. And is this not grotesque? To the grotesque are applied also other pejorative terms such as ridiculous, extravagant, capricious, or irregular. This being so, we would have the same reaction on seeing a top hat, a mustache, a portrait, the funnel of a transatlantic steamer, a bulldog, a pig, and so on, or on perceiving the reverberation of a sound. But it is not so. Nothing that man has created can be alien to him, and nobody can deny that these examples are also authentic creations like any other. Allow me to disagree with appreciation that have more to do certain moral prejudices than with aesthetic deductions. Close to the grotesque, we also find in the currency terms such as the fantastic, the Homeric, spaces in which are represented the imagined creatures whose morphology does not always coincide with those of real life, spaces where often something indefinable undergoes distortion, where the mind is unable to control the impulses that only affect the person who dreams. Here we can appreciate a work by the painter James Ensor entitled Death and the Masks. Not often can we see the word of the grotesque represented so poignantly in a work of art. The mask, criticism, mockery, even irreverence occupy an important part in both his painting and his engravings, often through the use of graffiti, placards, allusive signs. And now that we are imagining, let us remember that in the Hellenistic period, which has had such an influence on our Western culture, endeavors such as art, philosophy, literature, and navigation, for example, led to the exploration of distant lands, thereby greatly broadening our knowledge of other civilizations with their descriptions, mainly legendary and rich in fantasy, in which there appear misshapen human forms, monstrous animals, fauns, creatures with no heads, androgynous, chimeras, and so on and so forth. The encyclopedias incorporated these never previously imagined figures in their pages, thereby greatly enlarging our general culture with panoply of monsters that generate fear, monsters used as a threat against wherever fails to comply with the norms imposed by the power. Here we have some fragments of the Chronicle of Nuremberg, 15th century. Beautiful, ugly, or grotesque? No, they are a product of the imagination, and as such, the materialization of some concrete ideas that render service to a determined discourse, and that is how it is considered. Beauty, as I understand it, is a combination of, at times, indefinable elements which order in a precise manner makes possible that what is represented in, for example, a painting, exerts an attraction that transcends forms, colors, and textures. This reasoning is pretty basic, I know, but I believe it constitutes a valid departure point for an interesting debate. a debate which could enable us to know the opinions of creative artists and of those close to the arts and others, in the certainty that there would arise some surprising conclusions and comments concerning cognate expression or synonyms such as prettiness, the sublime, loveliness, excellence, and the morbid. A term, the morbid, associated pejoratively with other questions, in principle unrelated to our main subject. We also find other less common manifestations of this trend by taking note of and analyzing the wide variety of opinions expressed by certain observers, visitors to museums, and even to artist studios. Curious, conflicting, and even aberrant conclusions at which people arrive over the same matters, conclusions which separate more than they approximate different words, and which ideally it would be preferable to bring closer together in order to make life in itself better. To think that showing sensitivity can be a sign of weakness proves the necessity of constantly revising these concepts, although it may involve having to question at times the virtues of the educational system of a society such as ours, a society little given to reflection and more inclined to banality and insane consumerism. I am among those who believe that nothing is exclusive, that everything is complementary. In this sense, I believe in harmony in all its varieties, and that these too in beauty. I am also convinced generally that despite the disequilibrium produced by exclusions, art is more necessary now than ever, and that the better we succeed in expressing ourselves and communicating with others, the greater the pleasure. As regards education, I must insist again that in art, feeling is more important than mere dexterity. The extraordinary evolution of the technology to which we have access nowadays signifies, or should signify, that perfection is ever closer. Perfection is, in this case, is art, and art is the surest route, as I said before, to achieve the non-exclusive. For reasons of mental hygiene, we should not be ashamed of expressing our feelings and should allow them to flow naturally. I say again that such an attitude is not an indication of weakness, but rather a virtue. It is a fact that to advance in knowledge, it is necessary to apportation names not only to objects, but to effects, sensations, and other manifestation of the human being, and his spirit, also, of course, to those of all embarrassing nature. I recognize that while not giving much importance to models, rules, and other impositions, a certain familiarity with the art of painting has helped me to express my feeling and desires in short to life. I recognize equally that at times I have broken with certain convention, something about which I am unrepentant. The work that I have managed to produce up to now will have to express itself. What I can say is that in creating it, I have learned to be myself, which was my purpose from the beginning. I continue to make discoveries every day. My capacity for surprise is endless. My enthusiasm also. I search, and sometimes I even find. The solitude of my studio will come and stimulate me. The accumulation of diverse objects that surround me disturb me a bit, but they all form part of an atmosphere which it would be difficult for me to live without. They all contribute to a state of mind which encourages me to continue, and that is what I do. As regards atmosphere, I must add that this is precisely the effect I search to achieve in a painting, the effect that enables me to recognize myself in it. The fact that we admit the canon of beauty as a regulating or guiding principle does not mean that it is not subject to different interpretations. What is beyond discussion is that it is a reality, a variable reality, if you like, but a reality. This can be shown by its evolution through the years, gathering along the way, quite naturally, contradictions and paradoxes seemingly irreconcilable. But I repeat, I believe that this is how it should be. For me, beauty has always had more to do with intuition than with respect for a canon which, moreover, has changed down the years in accordance with the usage, modes, or other needs, depending on the moment and the place. By way of example, it is interesting to note how certain Renaissance authors, much given to didactics, in this case fine art didactics, hold for in certain catalogues of iconography, catalogues in which we find extensive descriptions of beauty that show us a young woman bearing, as well as her own physical attributes, a series of symbolic objects that contribute singularly to exalt her figure. This also occurs in catalogues of architecture. Here we have an example of an engraving that illustrates what Cesare Ripa's celebrated work, in which he provides profuse and curious representations of the most diverse themes, some of them from the last suspected virtues and vices to an infinity of expressions adaptable to any situation. Again, what can be said regarding the tyranny of beauty and how a person can subject himself or herself to plastic surgery, the operation known in Spanish as aesthetic. What is the ideal pursued or sought after? And what are we to make of bulimia or anorexia? Are we dealing with a desire for beauty comparable to that of the creative artist? I say no. I don't think that these developments have affected or modified the essence of the concept. I would say, rather, the opposite, that they have hugely broadened the spectrum, borrowing from the plastic art one of the most striking antagonisms, the grotesque. The grotesque, frequently considered unjustly a lesser art, was born practically at the same time as classicism in painting and ornamental sculpture. I still remember the impression, or better expressed, the shock to my system, the first time I saw, to start with in books and then in reality, a Romanesque facade or capital with terrifying sculpted scenes supposedly moralizing, or the gargoyles that proliferate in our gloomy Gothic cathedrals. It was scary. Chills went down my spine. Now that we are on the theme of morality and exemplarity, were these the best example of beauty? Not exactly. Were they perhaps example of the grotesque? At all events, they were and are works that, stripped of their truculent messages, turn out to be artistically and objectively admirable, although they don't belong to the category of the beautiful or the ugly. And by the way, what is the ugly? Is ugly the opposite of beautiful? Perhaps, or that which doesn't fit in with the infallible formula of a given concept or precept. But let us return to what really interests us. Let us continue to ask what beauty means to us personally. Beauty is what one imagines it to be. It is in the eye of the beholder. However, we must go beyond this celebrated aphorism. It is said, and it seems likely, that the imagination knows no limits. If this is true, it could also be said that if there were limits, they would be or are those of the human being. Often, imagination transforms into beauty what it is not beautiful, and the reverse. Here is the crux of the matter. Idealization is often linked to people's imaginative capacity, and this can cause many surprises. Art is a human product, and as such, it speaks to human beings about themselves. And talking about human beings, let us not forget their capacity to imagine things that are invisible but can be perceived without giving any explication. In the literature and art of the fantastic, it is said we are transported in imagination to unknown worlds where people like ourselves suddenly find themselves in the presence of the inexplicable. Only by means of such intimate perception do we succeed really in discerning between what we like and don't like, between what attracts and repels us, between what transmits us a sort of positive energy or, on the contrary, what makes us miserable. Beauty is not an easy term to define. I have often had the sensation that the definition has not always taken in consideration the component mystery, which is undoubtedly contained. We draw closer to the definition. We penetrate deeper, but always for this reason, with the certainty of never arriving to the bottom of the question. Could this also be mystery? As I promised earlier, I am only talking here about my personal experience as a painter. At times, prudence requires that I return to the dilemma. The specialists in this area, not I, are those best equipped to give an intelligible form to these concepts. Painting is my little oracle, my refuge, where I can hopefully throw light these questions, these mysteries. When I am in luck, some of their secrets come to me in a sort of catharsis, a sort of permanent introspection, searching desperately for a way out of the tunnel. In this respect, when I am asked why I am so attracted in painting to themes that fall outside the normal run of things, I usually adopt a dramatic tone and say that I began to paint more out of despair than by vocation. That something impelled me to communicate with my fellow human being by this means and no other. This is the reason why I have never stopped looking for the best, the optimum, for that which I want to imagine lies one end of the tunnel. Returning to beauty, We know that in almost all culture, the beautiful has always been related with the good, and the ugly with the bad. This does not mean that we must accept it as an infallible formula. In fact, it is a simplification which doesn't add anything to our understanding of the subject. Although I recognize that on occasions it has been, if not true, at least useful or helpful for those for whom these sort of considerations have never been a priority, for those who have never felt the need to cultivate the sensibility that, more or less developed, exists in all human beings. Some will have been unaware that they possess this ability. Others will have sought to deny it out of shame or for fear of appearing weak, as I said earlier. What is certain is that these values help to shape our taste and, in consequence, what enables us to enjoy our preferences. They facilitate access not only to the work created by mankind, but also to whatever object or telluric manifestation that can be perceived or felt as beautiful. So far, I have been talking about the significance that beauty has for me, mentioning briefly its antagonist, the grotesque, and locating this between beauty and the ugly. But this is not inexact, for which reason it is necessary, if not to establish fixed boundaries, at least to explore the differences involved, on some occasions evident and irrefutable. Sometimes it is difficult to pinpoint these concepts satisfactorily, but according to widespread agreement, they are not as ambiguous as is commonly thought. There are those who maintain the hypothesis that in the wide universe of the grotesque, there is also room for beauty. In dealing with the grotesque, it comes to be a similar complexity and with many elements common to both, although each one has its own particularity. Continuing with the controversy or conflict between beauty and the grotesque, I have to say that as far as I am concerned personally, it neither scandalizes nor disturbs me. On the contrary, for me, it opens the door to the imagination lacking in so many works of art considered superior solely because they are beautiful. Even the most orthodox authorities recognize or appreciate the beautiful elements contained in certain works deemed grotesque. I don't believe it is necessary to explain what the person contemplating these paintings distinguishes between one which usually offers a descriptive interpretation of certain scenes, while others shows composition, also very suggestive, arranged haphazardly, although not always. In both cases, they reveal an undoubted virtuosity or preciousness. These works may not be great art, but it is nonetheless true that in this representation intervene on equal terms what we could call good taste, exuberant imagination, and other geometrical or purely pictorial elements of the first order. This is a fragment chosen at random of the mural painting of the triclinium in Villa Carmiano on the theme of Neptune and Amymone in the 1st century before Christ. After Christ. On the Verano Hill, Gulf of Naples. In my judgment, the feminine figure is of extraordinary beauty in spite of having been extracted from a conjuncture which has been denominated grotesque for purely formal reason. In general, these basically decorative paintings contain a considerable amount of competent workmanship, skill, and a remarkable technical ability. It is true that taken as a whole, their discourse is more superficial, dispersed, and at times unsubstantial, and apparently of little depth compared with those other works termed major. Now is when one realizes how much fascination or passion we put in our contemplation or study of their works, and also when, at times, the doubts arise. Whatever our conclusion, and judging by the denominating aesthetics of the majority of the elements that surround us, is our daily life, the fact is that we need beauty as well as grotesque. At all events, the grotesque is an artistic category, perfectly defined and no recent phenomenon. Far from it. Let us not forget that the term derives from grotto, and that, as I said earlier, can be considered born side by side with classicism. Since then, it has passed from the merely ornamental to another status almost as broad as any other style to which cognate, component, or application have been incorporated. I have already mentioned the decorative panels of the Roman villas, and before this allusion, the architectural elements from the Romanesque, very much in the same line as the so disturbing bestiaries of those periods, both of which have awakened my interest, and as I have already remarked, have so much influenced my painting. If the search for beauty was important, these discoveries were none the less so. It would seem that all of this is what I needed in order to define my identity and to continue exploring those apparently opposed worlds. In my search and through the study of the Renaissance above all in Italy, I found more peace of mind. I could extract aesthetic and technical benefits. Learning was decisive. Accompanied by these findings, I added my interest in the Baroque, where beauty and the grotesque were melted down into something close to ugliness, even if this may sound a bit audacious. Along with this knowledge, I was fascinated by other images, new images from the 18th century, which referred me back once again to the grotesque, now with an added satirical sense, in order to shorten my narration. Let us go the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, a period when the grotesque, virulent criticism, satirical, and finally the protest becomes the order of the day. This sketch by George Grotesque belongs to the series Ex Homo from the 20s. It is a fragment of a report, sometimes ruthless, on the convulsed society in Germany between the wars. These works do not only remain a criticism, but have a place in the great history of universal art by dint of their understanding, one might say, indisputable quality. We find the same thing in literature and in the theater, from domestic comedies to rural dramas. And let us not forget fashion and its striking and extravagant complements. Those archibaldesque hats made of fruits or with taxidermic jewels, for example, birds in a nest, the leopard skin coat and tube-like skirt, the design of a dragonflight lamp to a bridal gown like a wedding cake, or the design of a exquisite funeral statuary of the nearest cemetery. At some point, I took the liberty of saying somewhat boldly that in art nothing is exclusive, which doesn't mean, of course, that everything is valid. And if it were necessary to clinch this point, I would say that the practice of exclusion involves serious risk and that artistic creation adopts widely varying forms that occupy quite legitimate areas that, while very different, nonetheless are complementary. To travel in a single direction, except when driving down on one-way street is, in my view, a great mistake. Diversity enriches by its own nature, and this begins. So art embraces an infinite variety of objects and effects for its own benefit. Orthodoxy, if we will, resides in the ideas and the method. Painting as a medium is the result of a mixture of diverse materials that provide, in their most basic application, texture and color. In my opinion, systematic exclusion is bad practice. Positive values are positive in themselves and not by the elimination of what we think insuitable. The practice of exclusion, I think, can lead us a sort of undesirable limitation. The grotesque is an art with its own personality, its own resource, and its wide-ranging registers. In all events, it could be argued that if not, the grotesque represents, let us say, the chronicle of the unofficial version of the conventionalism that control our lives beyond even art itself. Or perhaps it is the hidden face that represents transgression. This, according to my way of seeing things, is equivalent to an appreciable and salutary exercise in freedom and imagination. To see oneself reflected in a mirror, for example, is not sufficient, since we know beforehand whom or what we are going to find there. And if it is not what we wanted to see, we can have remedial recourse to cosmetics in order to become what at the moment we are not. In this sense, let us remember that the mask or disguise represents in carnival or theatrical iconography, and by extension in painting, which in itself is a reflection of these and other hidden phenomena. It may be debatable, but in imagined world, it's natural that only the imagination is really real. This apparent incongruity reminds us that in these questions, one must trade variably because the nuance acquire an enormous importance. The grotesque, for example, is not, as is sometimes maintained, equivalent to the pathetic. The grotesque has been considered as a classical and concrete allegorical style, and this means that the synonyms that have habitually been attributed to it are inadequate. The difference is clear. Examples such as this one are commonly found in conversations almost always informal, for which reason I prefer to qualify this error as linguistic lapses, since anyone who embarks on on a discussion of the subject knows full well that they won't be talking about the same thing. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if this lecture seems a bit chaotic, I must ask once again for your indulgence. If it were not for the fact that, and here I repeat myself, that I am an artist, not a critic or art historian, I am sure it will make more sense. As I said at the beginning, my first attempt is painting were those natural and inevitable in the case of a youth absolutely ignorant of the medium and whose only desire was to somehow represent those elements he found within himself, alien to the external world. Given my introverted personality, painting provides me with the life-enhancing sensation that at last, I was communicating with something, with somebody. This enthralled me to such an extent that I thought about it constantly. Books, as I also mentioned earlier, unlocked the door of my imagination, and always attracted by mystery, I read particularly the fantastic tales generated by the post-romantics. This fascination for the unknown developed at the same time I was discovering, as well as the classics, the painting of the pre-Raphaelites, the symbolistic, and finally that of the surrealists, as well as their literature. All of this had a huge influence on my first period until I began to achieve a more personal work. This image reproduces one of my oil paintings entitled The Anchored Dream. It represents a constant theme in my work, the dream. The dream, the dreamed, or the to be dreamed. It is this Homeric theme that, according to the art critics, constitutes the basis of my creativity. I suspect that from now on, I will be engaged in a process of synthesis. I have exhibited in a multitude of galleries and museums. I occasionally run workshops, and I have numerous projects underway. What the future has in store for me, I don't know, but what is certain is that I will keep painting in the same way as I started. This must be my destiny, and I still aspire to paint one day my best painting. Ladies and gentlemen, as was foreseeable, this lecture has not responded to even the least demand of oratory, although I would like to add that all of what I have said is that I habitually ponder over in the solitude of my studio. If I have achieved on this occasion, by means of words, to transmit my sentiments to you, believe me, this will indeed give me great pleasure. If by chance I have not, I must ask for your forgiveness. This photograph is still the same corner of my studio where I live, where I receive my spiritual nutrition, where I still let myself be surprised every day, the studio which I have no plans to leave. The painter who once dared to speak on a day like today of such an important theme as beauty and the grotesque pays you all his sincere respect. Thank you very much.
Well, last week we heard how the pursuit of mathematical beauty is used to deepen our understanding of the natural world, and this week we've heard how our appreciation of beauty can be enhanced by the exploration of ugliness. José Hernández has shown us how the visual arts use incongruity and distortion to draw attention to reality. And it has been fascinating to hear so creative an artist discussing his own creativity. I'm sure that we shall all take away with us memories of his images, combining this extraordinary imagination with breathtaking, meticulous draftsmanship. Thank you very much indeed.